Many cities have their dreams and legends of neighborhood sports. A few of them go on to professional halls of fame, but others leave us with a legacy of promise and disappointment. Our guest has taken a look at the legends and the changing landscape of playground basketball in Boston. The article was recently published in DigBoston. We'd like to welcome George Hassett. Thank you very much for being with us, George.
Thank you.
First of all, I just love the way your article starts, and I guess you can sort of recap by telling us how good these people were, if you go back 30 or 40 years.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, to me, it's a generation. The best years are the 60s, 70s, and maybe it has something to do with there weren't as many distractions, but I mean, the players, Jimmy Walker was a #1 overall draft pick and really changed the way basketball was played. Between the legs dribble, you might see any 10-year-old kid do that now. The crossover dribble, which is a fan favorite. And it was at a time where the best players didn't always get opportunity to go to the NBA, but Jimmy Walker did.
And the dunking, of course, too.
Yeah, and then another guy from Jimmy Walker's era from Boston is Spider Bennett. And then if you ask people who remember, they'll tell you that he was doing all the dunk contest type dunks that we started to see, like maybe in the 1980s, all of America, that he was doing those in the 60s.
One thing I was really puzzled by is that I'm reading about these people who were standouts in the neighborhood basketball courts, and they weren't even that pivotal on their high school teams. How do you account for that?
Oh, all the talent, like you said. Yeah. One fascinating character I talked to who's still involved with the Boston Neighborhood Basketball League is Mike Mitchell. And to give you an example of how much talent there was, Mike Mitchell had a tryout with the Celtics in 1980, and still in his neighborhood he was considered, and he's very honest about it to say, but he was more of a second-tier type player. He wasn't one of the first 6 best players from Boston.
Well, there was one person, I guess really a phenomenal talent you wrote about, and maybe with a misfortunate sequel to that, known as Stro. Tell me about him.
Oh, well, Stro, he was a year before what they call the Boston Six in 1972, and I'll say the Boston Six really put high school basketball in Boston on the map. So Stro was a little bit before all that attention, and Stro didn't get the type of attention that those guys got. But like he said himself, when they were on the playground and everything was equal, they knew who the best was. And Stro was, for everybody, for such an ego-driven sport, everybody knew Stro was the best.
We're talking with George Hassett of DigBoston about playground basketball. An example about Stro is that he just wasn't somebody who did one thing really well. He was all around. He was a great defender. And I think as you put it in the story, people were saying that if your team was down, you just give them the ball.
Yeah. Well, and then Stro, I think he had that one speed. He just went straight for the basket, and it annoyed coaches in the organized ball and at the top levels, which he played at Providence College. But they said at Providence, in a practice, he might score 80 points and have 30 turnovers. So coaches didn't want to let him loose, but in the street and in the playground, when he was free, he was the best.
Well, he did have one moment of glory with Providence, but talk about the moment of glory in Roxbury when there was another phenomenon who came here up from New York, and they went head to head. Tell us what happened.
Well, I would say it's one of the best moments of all time in Boston playground basketball, not just because it's against someone from New York, but it's against the great Charlie Scott, a gold medalist and a real pioneer in basketball, a playground legend himself. But that night was an off night, and Stro was feeling it, and he was outplaying Charlie Scott decisively to the point where the crowd, which was close to 1,000, was taunting Charlie Scott so much that he took the basketball and kicked it 2 court lengths away, threw a couple dollars on the court, because back then you had a $10 fine for technical fouls, and stormed off. And so I always think that was really Stro's validation in his moment to prove that he was one of the best.
And the crowd was really into it. I mean, they weren't just sitting there quietly. I mean, they were putting on the pressure, this poor fellow.
Oh yeah, it's fascinating. I was able to speak to Dennis Wilson, who's a basketball coach at Madison Park, and he ran a lot of the league, including the announcing, and so there's just a lot of back and forth in the court and the people, and that's what I love about playground basketball.
Now, I know this was a special showdown, but I guess in some way what it indicates is that playground basketball wasn't just something for the players themselves. This was a real social magnet. It really brought the whole community together.
Oh, I think so, and especially I wasn't alive at the time, but when you hear about people's accounts, it's just the streets were really buzzing with excitement.
What's different nowadays? I mean, we still have the Boston Neighborhood Basketball League. There were still young kids out there, some of them, more talented than others. But is the same kind of access to legend still there?
It's hard to say. In some ways there are, and sadly in some ways there aren't. Unfortunately, when I was interviewing people for this, people who are still involved with the game, they said it's just not safe for a lot of young kids to spend their entire days in the summer going to different neighborhoods and competing, and even heatedly. And these are all people who grew up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, spending their entire summers that way. So it's a tragedy that kids aren't safe enough to engage in that form. But I know that I read a great book in my research for this. It's called Asphalt Gods by Onaji Woodbine, and he pointed out that a lot of basketball tournaments nowadays, they address some of the most serious issues, and people get together, whether it's intact families, but tragically, most commonly is people, young males who die before their time.
In one example from that, going back in history to the 1970s, with all the turmoil over busing in Boston, problems at Mission Hill in the public housing development, and just a block or two away, you've got this basketball game with a bunch of white kids playing a bunch of black kids, and everybody's just focused on the basketball.
Yeah, and that was pretty common for the 70s, as uncommon as it was in Boston for mixed race crowds. You had the Boston Neighborhood Basketball League, the Boston Shootout, and these were always mixed race, all ages throughout the worst years of busing. And it was just a whole different city, I guess. One of the first BNBL champions was the North End. So I don't know if the North End could field a good basketball team now.
It was sad to see. I think it was Dennis Wilson reflecting on how gang turf has evolved to the point where you really have to be very careful about where games are played and who's playing in them.
Yeah, I know the BNBL mostly keeps the games indoors for a lot of safety reasons, and they emphasize, they focusing on young kids. Young kids can play outdoors. The sad part is when it gets to 18 plus, you would hope, and for years and for decades, that it was friendly neighborhood rivalry and heated neighborhood rivalry. And it's just sad that there's an element, but it's an element that exists in the world, and it's there in playground basketball, and that's why. Again, that's why I always like playground basketball, because it takes in the whole community.
Well, a fascinating read. People should look for the Dig Boston news box, and of course, go online, right?
Right.
All right. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
George Hassett from Dig Boston. Up ahead, the art segment with Chris Harding.